Something needs to be done about the mutant metaphor. Currently, it is fine, but I do feel like it's missing a lot of complexity and nuance in the subject it's trying to discuss in further detail. I could tell you what the mutant metaphor is, but if you clicked on this video, you probably already know, and if you don't, just Google it. The metaphor is very complex and has taken several different shapes throughout the decades, but I am specifically talking about the first ever metaphor it stood for as a civil rights metaphor. It's just, right now, it works perfectly fine if you're trying to get a more surface level interpretation of these metaphors, but if you try to be more complex about it, then it becomes a bit more hard to follow, I feel like. I think a perfect example is a concept that I've have been struggling to put into words. So let me give you an example. The idea that all mutants aren't made equally, and how the mutant experience really changes depending on what you look like as a person, and how your X gene has changed your physical appearance. I think a good allegory for this is colorism, which is an actual concept in real life. The idea that depending on your skin tone, your experience as a person in a certain group can change drastically, for the better or for the worst. I won't go into, again, too much detail into this because it is a very complex subject, and I am trying to focus more on the X-Men for this, but it is a good base idea for what I'm trying to talk about. In the X-Men, certain mutants wouldn't really have a problem being mutants, depending on what their power looks like. For example, Professor X. If he really wanted to, he could spend his entire life not telling anyone he's a mutant and simply reap the rewards of appearing human while also having mental powers. And he is not the only one, obviously. There's Jean Grey, there's Emma Frost, and there are others who aren't just telepaths. For example, there is Kitty Pryde or Jubilee. But there are some mutants where their X gene directly affects their appearance. I think the most famous one is Nightcrawler. The guy doesn't look human, and for some, he actually kind of looks demonic. And that is something which has really defined his character for a very long time. He has spent his entire life being persecuted by others, based simply on his appearance. And he is not the only one either. There's, for example, Mystique or Beast. The fact that they are mutants is the first thing which anyone else can visibly see about them. And in the world they live in, where every single mutant is persecuted, that makes their daily lives very much different from others, such as Professor X. I think for simplicity, let's call this mutationism. And I'm sure if you're watching this, you've read some X-Men comics, and this fact is probably something which you have realized as well. And it is something which the X-Men comics have tried to address in some shape or form. I just feel like the mutant metaphor seems to condense these issues and not make them the major sole focus point of any specific book. To make the book as appealing to as many people as possible, the mutant metaphor has to be as wide-ranging as possible. And for that reason, the very complex and specific ways in which that metaphor applies to real-life people and their experiences can really be watered down to the point where it's very non-existent. And to be clear, I do realize that this effect, mutationism if you will, is addressed in the comics. Professor X probably knew this from a very young age. He knew that he was very lucky when it came to his powers. He could have simply spent his entire life pretending to be human and reaping the benefits for himself, but he didn't do that. Instead, he decided to use his powers to help other people who aren't as fortunate as him. And not just him, many other X-Men do the same thing. My overall point is that the conversation usually only ends there. If they really wanted to talk about this, we could have had a far more nuanced and complex discussion on this issue, and the specific ways in which visibly being mutant affects someone. For example, if someone was visibly a mutant, but didn't wish to join the X-Men, What would their life look like? How does this affect their success in the job market? How about their relationships, platonic and romantic? It's questions like these which I wish were answered a bit more. But I do realize that the X-Men is a comic book about fighting mostly, and therefore the more ingrained social nuances aren't something that the writers may be as interested in portraying that much. I just think that a book focused on that or any other more complex or nuanced topic that goes with any specific metaphor could be very interesting. But yeah, that's just me. So yeah, I think I'm done. Peace.